My name is Jordan Hale. I'm 38 years old, and for 15 of those years, I served as a long-range weapons specialist in the United States Army. You've probably never heard my name. People like me aren't trained to stand out. We're trained to hit targets so far away, they don't even hear the shot before they fall. But on that particular morning, I missed every single one. The sun was already brutal at 0800, baking the gravel beneath my boots as I knelt behind the sandbag wall. Wind cut sideways through the range, slapping grit into my eyes. I blinked through the sting, locked in my scope, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide. So did the second. The third barely scratched the edge of the target plate. Behind me, laughter started in small, sharp bursts. First from the younger guys, then rippling out. I kept my face neutral. I was trained for that too. But then came the one voice I couldn't ignore. She's a disgrace to the uniform. I didn't need to turn around. I knew the voice. My father stood behind the observation rail, arms folded, face tight with restrained disgust. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. No attempt at subtlety. Just raw judgment laid bare under the Nevada sun. He wasn't just my father. He was Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Hale, retired. The man who'd taught me to shoot before I learned to read. The man who told me that excellence wasn't optional. It was the bare minimum for someone who carried the Hale name. That name felt like a weight on my back as I stood, ejected the magazine, and walked off the line. I could feel the stares behind me like pins in my skin. The sneers, the sideways glances, the smug nods from those who'd decided I didn't belong the moment I walked into the training cycle. And then, the SUVs pulled up. Two of them, black and unmarked, with government plates and windows tinted darker than regulation. They rolled to a stop like ghosts with engines, kicking up a cloud of dust that silenced every voice on the range. The driver stepped out first, but it was the man in the back who drew every eye. Commander Cole Reeves, SEAL Team Brass, combat-worn. Broad-shouldered and deadly quiet. He didn't walk, he surveyed. Moved with that unteachable confidence, the kind you only earn in places that don't exist on maps. Without a word, he approached the tower where the instructors stood frozen in confusion. He didn't look at the range scores, didn't ask for a report. He just pointed toward the firing line. Set up the impossible shot. The lead instructor frowned. Sir, no one can make that shot in these conditions. Reeves didn't flinch. I didn't ask for a weather report. My stomach twisted. I knew exactly what this was. The trigger phrase had been spoken. I walked back to the firing line in total silence. Nobody laughed now. Even my father stood still, his lips parted like he wasn't sure whether to mock me or pray. I lay down, adjusted my bipod, and pulled the bolt. The target was 2,000 yards out. So far away it shimmered like a mirage. One breath in, one squeeze. The shot snapped across the wind like a crack of thunder. 4 seconds passed. Then, the white flag at the edge of the world folded over and fell. I stood slowly. Reeves gave a single nod. The instructors just stared. My father said nothing. For the first time in my life, he looked small. There was no cheer, no applause, just silence. The kind of silence that says we didn't know. We should have known. And now, it's too late to pretend otherwise. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply cleared my rifle, engaged the safety, and walked back to the staging tent. Reeves left without ceremony, the same way he came, like a man who never needed permission to arrive or a reason to leave. My boots crunched against the gravel as I walked past rows of stunned faces. Some eyes followed me with awe, others with confusion, and some, like my father's, with growing dread. They didn't understand what they'd just seen, not fully, but they knew enough to stop underestimating me. Back in the barracks, I cleaned my weapon the same way I always did. Barrel first, chamber next, optics last. I moved with the same methodical rhythm that had been drilled into me for years. The whispers started that night. She's not just a shooter. Did you see the way she controlled her breathing? That wasn't normal, that was surgical. I didn't answer, I didn't engage. I kept to my bunk in the corner, back to the wall, eyes on the door, just like I always had. The same recruits who used to mutter dead weight under their breath now avoided eye contact. Even the instructors kept their voices more neutral during briefings. Only one person approached me directly, Staff Sergeant Callum, a quiet, steady operator who never bought into the ridicule. He sat across from me during chow, didn't say a word for a full minute, then nodded once. "I saw what you did," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "I also saw what you didn't do," he continued. "You held back, all week. Why?" I didn't answer, but I didn't deny it either. He stood to leave, then paused. "Whatever they think, they'll rewrite it in their heads to protect their egos. But me? I saw a ghost with a rifle." He walked away. Later that night, I passed my father in the hallway of the admin building. He was on the phone, voice low, posture stiff. When he saw me, he stopped mid-sentence. We locked eyes for half a second. He opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to scold, maybe to lie. But nothing came out. I walked past him without a word. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. People talk about turning points like they happen in a flash. Like a single moment severs the past from the future. But I know better. That shot, the impossible shot, wasn't the beginning. It was the culmination. It didn't come from some miracle. It came from every brutal lesson I learned the hard way. Every scar I carried inside and out. Every hour I spent invisible, underestimated, dismissed. I had been hitting targets no one could see since my 20s, but no one ever watched. No one ever cared. And when they did, they assumed it was luck. Especially him. My father never believed in me. Not really. He believed in shaping me into something he could be proud of, but only if I became his reflection. And when I didn't, he labeled me weak, unworthy. He wasn't proud of that shot. I could see it in his eyes. He was afraid of it, afraid of what it meant, that all his years of dismissal had been wrong, that his daughter had become something he couldn't control, couldn't explain, that she'd surpassed him. So no, that shot wasn't just a shot. It was a reckoning, not just for him, but for me. Because after all those years of silence, I finally saw what I was capable of when I stopped asking for permission. And that was the shot that broke him. My father was Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Hale, battle-hardened, precision-driven, a soldier forged in the Gulf War era and proud of it. He wore his medals like armor and his silence like a blade. In his world, the military was the only place that made sense, where rules were rules, outcomes were earned, and emotions were filed away like outdated maps. Strength meant survival. Weakness got people killed. That was the code. And I was raised under that code like it was gospel. I don't have many childhood memories that don't involve the sharp scent of gun oil or the bark of my father's voice, echoing across an empty backyard turned makeshift range. While other kids were riding bikes or playing soccer, I was learning to breathe through my diaphragm and compensate for wind drift. My first BB gun came before my first birthday cake with candles. By 10, I could strip and reassemble an M4 in under 90 seconds. By 12, I was hitting dime-sized groupings at 200 yards. And if I didn't, he'd grab my wrist, not harshly enough to leave a bruise, but just enough to make his point crystal clear. He'd twist it, correcting my grip by force. And if my eyes watered, he'd stare with a disgusted kind of silence, like I was wasting his time, his bloodline. "Pain is just your weakness leaving the body," he'd say, as if that explained everything. At 14, I flinched during a dry fire drill. It was only for a fraction of a second. My finger hesitated on the trigger. His response wasn't verbal. He took the rifle from my hands, set it down, and walked away. He didn't talk to me for a week. Not as punishment. Not even out of anger. Just disappointment. That, to him, was worse. Years later, I realized that wasn't discipline. That was control. A way to shape me into something sharp, functional, and his. But back then, I didn't understand that. I just wanted him to see me. To believe I had value beyond my kill potential. He taught me the mechanics of excellence, but not how to recover from failure. He taught me precision, but not resilience. He taught me how to survive, not how to live. By the time I graduated high school, I already knew two things for sure. I would join the military. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I would never be good enough for him. At my enlistment ceremony, he shook my hand like a fellow soldier, not a father. There was pride in his eyes, sure, But it was conditional, fragile, something I could lose with a single mistake. "Don't embarrass us," he said. That was his send-off. Not "stay safe," not "I love you," just a warning. So I made a vow. I would train harder, shoot farther, push myself until I could outpace every ghost he ever chased. Not to prove something to the army, to him. But the truth is, when you spend your life chasing validation from someone who only loves conditionally, you end up building a version of yourself that looks strong, but is quietly breaking. And I didn't realize how deeply I'd been shaped, sharpened, really, until years later, when I found myself back on that same kind of range, under that same brutal sun, wearing a uniform I had earned, still hearing his voice behind me, still wondering if I'd ever be more than his disappointment in camo. But that would change. Not with words, not with arguments, with a single impossible shot. The one thing he'd never believe I could make, until I did. There's a myth that elite soldiers are born different, that there's something in their blood, something primal and cold and unshakable that makes them who they are. It's a lie. We're not born. We're built. I was 24 when I was selected, not for a promotion, not for a school, but for a program that didn't officially exist. No badge, no name, no record in any accessible database, just a call. One sentence. "You've been cleared for Tier Shadow." I remember the moment so vividly. A beige briefing room, 2 men in suits, 1 empty chair. They didn't ask if I wanted in. They just said I'd been chosen. For what, I asked. For operations where no one admits the flag was ever flown. There was a pause. They waited. I nodded. That was enough. From that point on, my life became layers of silence stacked atop each other. Every connection I had was stripped down, reclassified, buried. My mail was rerouted. My medical file was redacted. Even my rank disappeared from public rosters. The program didn't want warriors. It wanted ghosts. We were trained to disappear into terrain, into crowds, into silence. Long-range precision, urban reconnaissance, linguistic insertion, biometric evasion, close-quarters neutralization. But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was the conditioning. They didn't just want operatives who could kill. They wanted operatives who could be controlled. So they built triggers, mental locks, behavioral suppressors. We were encoded to operate only when activated by specific commands, phrases embedded during sleep deprivation cycles and hypnosis drills. It sounds like fiction, I used to think it was, until I lived it. They called it operational gatekeeping. The idea was simple. Outside of activation, you were to perform like a standard soldier, passable, competent, but unremarkable. It preserved the secrecy, protected the program, prevented accidents. And above all, you do not go active unless ordered. They made that part crystal clear. Break protocol and you disappear, not back into shadows, but into the kind of silence that doesn't echo. So I followed orders. For 4 years, I operated under Ghost State. A code name I didn't choose. Missions I don't get to admit I survived. I never missed a shot. Never compromised a team. Never spoke a word I wasn't told to say. People died without hearing me coming. People lived because I saw things others didn't. I moved from desert to jungle, to snow to city without ever planting roots. We weren't given medals, we were given debriefs and injections and a new target. And eventually, a new wound. My last mission in the program ended in a blast. Close-range IED. Half my body went into shock. The other half was in too much pain to care. I don't remember much of the evacuation. I just remember the taste of blood, the noise in my ears, and the silence of not knowing if I'd ever be cleared again. Stateside, I was placed under temporary medical evaluation. A minor promotion was given to satisfy paperwork, and I was assigned to a regular training unit to see if I could still function in a conventional role. The catch? I hadn't been reactivated, which meant my conditioning remained locked. My mind stayed suppressed. My skills, my instincts, my training, none of it accessible. Unless someone said the words. So when I walked into that new unit, I had a choice to make. Pretend I was just another soldier, or risk violating everything I'd been built for. I chose the former, and for the next several weeks, I lived as the shadow of myself. Quiet, clumsy, broken. Until the day a SEAL commander whispered the phrase that shattered every chain. After the explosion, I spent nearly 3 weeks in a military hospital overseas. Wired up, sedated, waking in fragments. The IED hadn't killed me, but it had left its mark. Shrapnel in my hip, bruised lungs, and nerve damage that would take months to retrain. I couldn't stand without support for 11 days, and in the Ghost Knife program, anything less than full operational capacity meant immediate suspension. So I was sent back stateside. No fanfare, no welcome home, just a sealed envelope with reassignment orders and a quiet note from command. Pending review of long-term fitness for special assignment. That's how I ended up in the desert, in a standard training unit designed for mid-career recertification. They called it Combat Readiness Evaluation. In practice, it was a place where the Army decided who still had value and who didn't. I was told, act within normal soldier parameters. That meant no perfect groupings, no advanced tactics, no instincts that would give me away. I had to blend in, perform adequately, not exceptionally. So I did. I ran slow enough to be average, fumbled reloads just enough to draw disappointed looks, missed easy targets by fractions of an inch, kept my stance too wide, then too narrow. Let them think I was struggling. I even let the nickname dead weight stick. It wasn't easy. Nothing about pretending to be less than what you are ever is. But I'd learned early. In our line of work, obedience sometimes looks like failure. And then, because the universe has a twisted sense of timing, he walked in. Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Hale, retired. My father. They'd brought him in as a visiting tactical advisor to observe field simulations and assist in performance reviews. A face from the old guard. A reputation to intimidate the green ones. The moment I saw him, something deep in me twisted. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 3 years. Now he stood 10 feet from me in full military dress, hands behind his back, watching me miss a shot I could have made blindfolded. He didn't blink, didn't smile. He just turned to the instructors beside him and said flatly, "That one's not ready for combat." And they nodded, because who would question a father who'd raised a soldier? Who would guess he'd spent years quietly convincing the world I was never good enough to wear the uniform we both served? From the very first drill, I made sure I looked just competent enough to keep from being pulled, but not good enough to be remembered. When we were handed our weapons for marksmanship assessment, I loaded my rifle with fingers that pretended to fumble. I allowed my breathing to falter just enough to throw off my shot. I hesitated between targets, let my transitions lag. My trigger pull was clean, but my aim was deliberately a fraction too high, a touch too slow. I knew exactly what I was doing. The instructors didn't say much, just wrote things down, glanced at me with quiet disappointment, and moved on. My squad, on the other hand, was louder about it. It didn't take long before whispers turned to jokes. "Maybe she's still concussed," one of them muttered after a training exercise. Or maybe Ghost Knife means she's already dead weight. The nickname stuck faster than I expected. Dead weight. The first time someone called me that out loud, I didn't even blink. I just kept stripping my rifle in silence while the others laughed across the tent. They thought I was too slow, too unsure, too shaky to be anything but a burden. And I let them think it. In a room full of predators, sometimes the best way to survive is to look like prey. Still, there were moments when it burned. Like during a team assault simulation when I deliberately stepped out of formation by half a second, threw off the entry timing, and caused our breach to fail. The instructor called the drill. The red light on the wall flashed. Failure. I heard the groans behind me, felt the weight of frustration in every breath that followed. "Come on," one of the younger guys muttered, pulling off his helmet. "How many more drills are we going to screw up because she can't move on time?" "I'm starting to think she's here to make the rest of us look good," another added. I stood there, helmet in hand, jaw clenched so tight I could feel the pressure behind my molars. But I said nothing, because saying something would have been breaking cover. Truth is, I hated it. I hated letting people believe I was weak. I hated every second of playing the fool in a uniform I'd earned 100 times over. But I had learned, long before this place, that there's a difference between being underestimated and being dismissed. One can be weaponized. The other breaks you, so I let them underestimate me. Let the nickname echo through the halls, the chow tent, the training range. I let them get comfortable in their contempt. Because contempt makes people sloppy. And when the time came, when someone finally unlocked what was sleeping inside me, they wouldn't just be surprised. They'd be humbled. Every missed shot, every deliberate mistake, it wasn't a sign of weakness. It was patience. It was restraint. It was control. And in war, control is the sharpest weapon of all. She's just a paper soldier. That's what he said. Not in private. Not to a superior officer behind closed doors. No, he said it in front of the squad during a debrief. His voice calm, measured, and entirely intentional. She looks like a soldier, acts like a soldier. But when the pressure's on, she folds. She doesn't belong in this uniform. I was standing 10 feet away, wiping carbon from my rifle bolt. My hand didn't stop moving, not even when the words landed. If she weren't my daughter, he added, louder this time, she would have been cut from this unit a long time ago. There was a pause, just long enough for the weight of the statement to settle into the air like a fog. And then came the shifting stares, the quiet coughs, the thin, suppressed smirks around the room. They didn't say anything, not out loud, but they didn't have to. His words had given them permission. After that, the jokes got meaner. She must have had a hell of a sponsor to stay on this long. Guess nepotism works even in combat readiness, huh? Dead weight with a famous last name, tragic combo. Still, I didn't react. That too was part of the training. I'd learned to absorb ridicule like body armor absorbs impact. Tight jaw, even breath, eyes locked forward. The most dangerous people in the room are rarely the ones who speak the loudest. He wasn't just undermining me. He was actively framing me as a liability, and I understood why. My success was a threat to the legacy he'd built. My failure validated his belief that I'd never be his equal. And in this setting, where his reputation preceded him and his word carried weight, he knew that breaking me in front of others would be more effective than doing it in private. He didn't need to disown me. He just needed to make sure no one believed in me. But not everyone bought into it. Staff Sergeant Callum didn't laugh, didn't look away. He caught my eye one afternoon after a particularly brutal exercise, where I'd accidentally lost my footing and cost the team a key objective. The rest of the squad was venting behind my back, again. Loud enough that I could hear every word. Callum walked over during gear check, quiet, intentional. "You know exactly what you're doing," he said. I kept my eyes on the rifle in my hands, didn't respond. He crouched beside me. "You're not broken. You're waiting." That got my attention. I looked at him, just for a second. He didn't smile, didn't try to comfort me. "I just hope it's worth it," he said. "Whatever game you're playing, whatever mission you're still on." Then he stood and walked away. There was no judgment in his voice, just observation. Callum was the only one who seemed to sense there was something beneath the surface, a reason for the deliberate underperformance, the stoic silence, the way I absorbed every insult without flinching. Maybe he didn't know the full picture, but he'd seen enough to know that I wasn't what they thought I was, that I wasn't who my father claimed I was. The truth? Every insult, every cruel comment, every time my father used my name like a punchline, it chipped away at me. Even with all the training, even with all the mental conditioning, I'm still human. And no matter how many battles you've won, it's hard to stand tall when your own blood is the one aiming low. But I held the line. Because that's what you do when the mission isn't over. You stay low, you stay silent, and you wait for the call. Because one day, the ones who laughed will have nothing to say. And the ones who doubted will finally understand what it costs to carry greatness in silence. I was 17 the first time I made a shot that mattered to him. We were in the backyard of our house in Colorado, just the two of us. It was early spring, the sky slate gray and heavy with the kind of storm that made every sound feel louder. The wind howled through the trees. Rain was coming, fast. He didn't cancel the lesson. He just walked outside, placed a rusted soda can on top of the wooden fence post 50 yards out, then handed me the rifle. "No excuses," he said, adjusting the stock against my shoulder. "If you can shoot in this, you can shoot in anything." My fingers were stiff from the cold, my sleeves soaked from the wind-blown drizzle, but I locked in, did what he taught me, controlled my breath. The wind jerked sideways. I fired. The can disappeared with a hollow metallic ping, flipping into the air before vanishing behind the fence. A perfect shot. I turned to him, expecting something. A nod. A look. One of those rare, hard-earned signs that I'd done well. Instead, he stared at the fence post, then down at me. "One hit means nothing," he said flatly. He walked past me, picked up the rifle, and headed toward the house. That was it. No good job. No, you're getting better. Just that one sentence. I stood there in the rain, my heartbeat still racing, hands tingling from the recoil, staring at the place where the can had been. And I remember thinking, if that wasn't enough, whatever will be. Later that night, I replayed the moment over and over in my head, trying to figure out what I did wrong. I'd hit the can, dead center, through wind and rain. First try. But to him, that wasn't proof. Because one success in his mind didn't prove anything. It didn't erase the mistakes that came before. It didn't guarantee you could do it again. And it sure as hell didn't earn his approval. That memory stayed buried for years, until the day I dropped the target at 2,000 yards and saw the same exact look on his face. Not pride, not awe, just silence. Because even then, even after everything, to him, it still wasn't enough. And maybe it never would be. But that didn't matter anymore, because I had stopped shooting to prove anything to him. Now I shot to remember who I truly was. They called me in after morning chow. The tone in the admin officer's voice was clipped, overly formal, like he was trying to keep emotion out of something that would carry weight. I followed him across the yard, past the barracks and into the CO's office. A windowless, low-ceiling room that smelled faintly of sweat and disinfectant. Inside, 3 men were waiting. One was Captain Mallory, head of the training unit. Another was the medical officer. The third, a civilian contractor with a personnel file open in front of him. None of them looked at me when I entered. "Staff Sergeant Hale," Mallory began. "We've completed your 2-week performance evaluation and reviewed the reports submitted by your instructors." He tapped the folder once, as if for emphasis. "The consensus is clear. Your current performance doesn't meet minimum operational standards." I nodded. No defense, no surprise. He continued. "You've shown signs of hesitation, lapses in judgment during team exercises, and an inability to meet time requirements in basic combat scenarios. Combined with your recent medical history, we believe a return to active duty would pose unacceptable risk." The words were meant to sting. They didn't. "We've prepared discharge documentation," the civilian added. "Administrative with medical consideration. You'll maintain benefits. It's clean. Quiet." He slid a form across the table. I didn't even read it. I picked up the pen, signed on the dotted line, and handed it back. No one said a word, because in their minds, the conversation was over. But the meeting hadn't ended. Because as I stood to leave, the door opened behind me, and in walked Commander Cole Reeves. No announcement, no salute, just presence. The air shifted. Even Mallory straightened. The civilian looked like he'd swallowed his own tongue. Reeves stepped forward, glanced at the folder, then at me. "This her?" he asked. Mallory hesitated. "Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Hale. Evaluation concluded this morning." Reeves ignored him completely. He turned to me, studying me the way a man studies a loaded weapon. Calm, careful, calculating. Then he said, "I want to see her shoot. For real. One time." It wasn't a question. The silence in the room stretched. Mallory cleared his throat. "Sir, she's already—" Reeves cut him off. "One shot, set the range, no score sheet, no excuses." I stood still, spine straight, because I knew exactly what he meant. He was activating me. The real evaluation was about to begin. The moment I stepped out of that office, I felt the shift. Whispers followed me like shadows. By sundown, the entire training compound was buzzing. The woman who couldn't hit a standing target at 50 yards was being granted one last shot. Not just any shot, the shot. The one whispered about in mess halls and firing ranges like a ghost story. 2,000 yards, one bullet, one chance. They said it was all staged the first time. That maybe Reeves had rigged the target. That my scope was altered. That the wind was faked. That I was just a puppet for some covert propaganda unit. propped up to tick diversity boxes or ride the Hale family name. Some said I had slept my way through clearance. Others said I cracked mentally after the injury, and Reeves was doing a pity favor. I didn't respond to any of it. I kept moving, quietly, precisely. I cleaned my rifle, my own, not the range-issued ones. M40A5, old-school bolt action. The kind I trained on in the black program, the kind I knew by heart. I adjusted the scope, zeroed it by instinct, checked wind calibration, air density, humidity, distance markers. My fingers moved like they were remembering an old song. No one saw me, but they watched anyway, through half-open doors, from behind storage crates. And when I stepped onto the range the next morning, a full crowd had gathered. Though no one admitted why they were there. Some leaned against trucks, arms folded, pretending boredom. Others stretched or passed around thermoses like it was another normal drill. But their eyes told the truth. This wasn't just a test, it was a reckoning. There was even a betting pool. I overheard it in the chow hall. $10 said I would fumble the round. 20 I wouldn't even pull the trigger. 50 that I'd hit nowhere near the target. And my father? He stood behind the crowd, arms crossed, sunglasses on even in the shadow of the hangar. His expression unreadable. But I knew that stance. Part of him wanted me to collapse, to confirm his lifelong theory that I wasn't built for it, that I was soft, emotional, undisciplined, a disgrace. But another part was afraid. Because if I made the shot again and made it clean, something would crack. Not just his image of me, but his image of himself. Because for all the yelling, the beatings, the drills that blurred into punishments, he knew. He knew I was the best shot he ever trained. And that truth terrified him. Because it meant he'd broken something he didn't build. And he wouldn't be able to control what came next. Reeves approached as I lay prone on the mat. No encouragement, no advice, just a simple nod. The target was barely visible, an aluminum plate the size of a helmet, swaying ever so slightly in the desert wind. Reeves raised one hand. No words, just the signal. I chambered the round and waited. They marched me out to the open range like I was heading for execution. The sun was brutal, the kind of heat that warps the horizon and makes men hallucinate. The kind that smells like copper and gun oil. The air shimmered above the sand. Wind hissed low and dry across the ground like a warning. The range officer pointed. 2,000 yards out, almost swallowed by the landscape, a white flag had been rigged to flutter in the wind. No metal, no rigid surface, just fabric. No ricochet. You either pierced it clean or missed entirely. Single shot, Reeves said beside me, low and even. No warm-ups, no adjustments. Show them. I nodded once. They handed me my rifle. It felt familiar in my hands, like an extension of memory. I checked nothing. I'd calibrated everything the night before. I laid down on the mat. The world narrowed to the rifle stock against my cheek, my heartbeat, and the subtle pulse of wind against my fingertips. I didn't need a spotter, didn't want one. Behind me, the gathered soldiers fell completely silent. Even the cocky ones who'd placed bets, even the skeptics, even the officers. And somewhere in that crowd stood my father, his arms likely crossed, jaw locked, sunglasses hiding whatever storm brewed beneath. I imagined him staring at my posture, me lying prone, completely still, the textbook position he'd drilled into me when I was barely 12. Back when I still wanted his approval, I inhaled. Wind at 8 o'clock, 3 miles per hour. Adjust half click left. Elevation exact. I exhaled. The range fell away. There was only the fluttering white of the flag. One breath, one shot. The trigger broke like glass beneath my finger. Recoil snapped through my shoulder, then silence. For a split second, the wind carried on like nothing had happened. Then the flag jolted. It tore clean through the center and drifted down like a wounded bird. One bullet, 2,000 yards. No trick shots, no assistance. I sat up. The silence behind me was thick, stunned. Someone muttered, "No way." Another, more softly, "Holy hell." I didn't look back. I didn't need their reactions. I stood, brushed the sand from my arms, secured my rifle. Only then did I turn. The crowd looked different now, eyes wide, mouths parted. Doubt shattered, and in the back, my father. He didn't blink, didn't speak, just stared like something inside him had broken, like he was watching a version of me he never thought real, too real now to deny. All the years he told me I wasn't enough, that I was weak, that I lacked the will, but now every cruel word he'd spoken dissolved in the space between us. Because no one else had ever made that shot, not even him. I walked past Reeves. He didn't smile, didn't clap. He just said, "Good," and walked away. Because when you've been trained in silence, you don't need applause. You need the truth. And now they all had it. I didn't even get a chance to wipe the dust from my boots before I was summoned. No congratulations, no handshake. Just an order, report to command. Now, inside the debriefing room, the air was cooler, but the tension was worse than the heat outside. 2 officers I didn't know by name sat across the table, ranked, polished, and stone-faced. Commander Reeves stood near the window, hands folded behind his back, silent, watching. One of the officers leaned in. "You care to explain what just happened out there, Specialist Hale?" I kept my posture straight, neutral. He flipped open a folder. "Your training file says you're mid-tier at best, failing evals, psychological markers indicating hesitation under pressure. But then you hit a 2,000-yard shot that not even our top-tier snipers could pull off." Silence. I didn't move, didn't speak. "Was this some kind of setup?" the second officer pressed. "Were you hiding your skill? Or is this some act of insubordination?" Still, I said nothing. Because I couldn't. Not without crossing a line I was sworn never to step over. Then Reeves finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady. "She didn't fail your evaluations." Both officers turned toward him. "She followed them. To the letter." The older of the two frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Reeves took a slow step forward. "It means she was under restricted protocol, not cleared to display combat aptitude unless directly authorized by a program lead. I gave that clearance today." "Why wasn't she cleared sooner?" "Because she wasn't meant to be tested in public." The room fell silent. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "What program are you referring to, sir?" Reeves didn't answer. He just looked at me. "Let's just say," he said, "you weren't debriefed on that level of classification." The implications sank in like ice water. One of them started to speak again, but Reeves cut him off. "She wasn't lying, she wasn't underperforming. She was following deeper orders than yours." They looked at me now, not as a suspect, but as something they didn't quite understand. "Specialist Hale," the senior officer finally said, "do you have anything to add?" I shook my head once. "No, sir." He waited a beat. "You do realize your performance today will change your file. This won't stay quiet." I didn't answer that either. Because the truth wasn't mine to explain. Because no matter what they recorded, what they filed, what they thought they knew, there was a whole other layer they'd never access. Behind closed doors, off the record, written in code and buried under redacted pages, was the reason I knew how to make that shot. Reeves nodded toward the door. "You're dismissed, Specialist." I stood, saluted, and walked out, knowing they'd spend the rest of the week trying to decode something that was never meant to be on their radar in the first place. Most people think snipers are just good at aiming, that it's all breath control and mathematics, wind calculation, timing. But for me, it was different. Because I wasn't just trained to shoot. I was programmed. Not in the science fiction sense. No wires, no chips. Nothing you could trace or scan. Just layers of conditioning, commands buried under trauma, stress triggers, and behavioral lockouts. It started when I was 19, fresh out of basic. I'd performed well in marksmanship, well enough that I was pulled aside after final evaluation. A woman in plain uniform asked if I'd be interested in a special opportunity. No details, just a signature. Then I disappeared from the standard track. They called it Tier Black. Off the record. No official affiliation. My name stopped appearing on rosters. My service record grew a blank space where my next deployment should have been. That blank space was where they rewrote me. We were kept in isolation. No units, no insignia, no mirrors, just drills. Day in, day out. Shooting in sandstorms, in hurricanes, in sub-zero ice fields. Timed shots with 0 misses allowed. They trained us to function in sleep-deprived states. under hypoxia in chemical fogs. Sometimes I didn't know if I was awake or hallucinating. Sometimes that was the point. But it wasn't the physical that shaped us. It was the mental. They ran simulations to break empathy, loaded VR feeds with screaming civilians, crying babies, targets that looked like friends. They wanted to see if we flinched, if we hesitated. And when we did, we weren't punished. We were reset. They used silence, deprivation, psychotropic sequencing, psychological loops. A word would trigger a mood. A tone would cause shutdown. Over time, I stopped trusting my own instincts. My world became command-based. Unless the right phrase was spoken, my top-tier skills remained dormant. That's how the system worked. We weren't taught to act. We were coded to respond. Reeves called it voluntary dormancy with selective access. In plain English, I was a locked weapon, and unless someone input the proper signal, I couldn't even raise the safety. That's why I shot poorly in training. Why I failed in front of my father, because the system inside me wouldn't allow activation, not unless someone at the proper clearance level whispered the command. And that day on the range, Reeves gave it. He didn't say much, didn't need to. Just the right arrangement of syllables, masked inside a passing sentence, and the switch flipped. Everything that had been buried came roaring back like it had never left. Not muscle memory, muscle truth. That's how deeply they'd built it. Reeves once told me during a rare moment of honesty, we didn't want assassins. We wanted fail-safes. You're a contingency plan. You fire when no one else can. I asked him if that made us heroes. He didn't answer, maybe because the answer wasn't his to give. But as I sat in that quiet barracks room after the debriefing, I understood why no one clapped when I made the shot. Because what I did wasn't a display of talent. It was proof that the programming still held, that I could still be triggered, still turned on like a machine. And deep down, I hated how effortless it felt. Because if I didn't even need to think, if I was just waiting for the right voice, then what part of me was still mine? That night, I stared at my reflection in the black glass of the barracks window. No insignia, no medals, no certainty, just Jordan Hale, weaponized, and still waiting for someone to say the next line. The call came late, not through any official channel, no encrypted server, no chain of command. Just a soft ring on a number I hadn't used in years. I recognized the voice immediately. It was the same woman who first recruited me at 19. She didn't say her name, she never had to. Her voice was calm, without urgency. Jordan, she said. You don't need to prove anything anymore. The assessment was a cover. We've seen what we needed to see. I didn't respond right away. My fingers clenched the edge of the desk, knuckles pale against the wood. You're being reactivated, she continued, but not reassigned. You get to choose this time. That word echoed. Choose. No parameters, no targets, no destination, just permission. I had spent most of my adult life following orders buried beneath words, instructions dressed up as suggestions, responses triggered by codes I didn't understand. And now they were giving me the one thing they'd trained out of me. Agency. I stood there for a long time after the call ended. The room felt both smaller and wider. Outside, the wind stirred dust along the training fields. The same field where I'd fired the 2,000-yard shot. The same field where silence fell when the flag dropped. I'd been Jordan the ghost, Jordan the dead weight, Jordan the locked weapon. Now I was something else. Or maybe I was nothing yet. The choice lay in front of me like an unmarked road. I could go back into the black, into the hidden world that built me. Serve again, unseen. Be the failsafe they trusted. Or I could disappear on my own terms. Live a life that didn't begin and end with clearance levels. They had programmed me to wait for the right voice. But maybe this time, it needed to be my own. I took a breath. Not the kind you take before a shot, steady and sharp. This one was different. It didn't prepare me to fire. It prepared me to live. After the impossible shot, the silence didn't last long. By the time I'd walked off the range, whispers had already taken root like mold in an old house. She just got lucky, one said, as if 2,000 yards could be bridged by chance. Wind must have died down at the perfect time, another offered, looking anywhere but at me. She probably had help, someone muttered. Someone fed her wind speed or dropped tech into her scope. It's always easier to dissect something than to accept it, to rationalize a moment rather than admit you saw something you didn't understand. A few tried to sound technical. They stood in circles discussing bullet trajectory, the Coriolis effect, mirage waves. They used big words to shrink what happened. No one asked me directly. No one said, "How did you do that?" Because to ask would be to acknowledge that I had done it. Except Callum. He didn't come up with theories. He didn't offer me praise. He just passed me on the gravel path, stopped briefly, and gave a single nod. That was enough. He had seen it. All of it. The act, the restraint before it, the meaning behind the silence I'd carried like a pack for weeks. And then, there was my father. He didn't speak, not at the debrief, not in the hallway, not when the instructors shook my hand. He kept his hands behind his back like he was standing in formation, his posture perfect, his jaw set. I watched his eyes track everything in the room, but not once did they meet mine. I used to spend years chasing that look, that sliver of approval, that nod, that word. But now I understood. He couldn't meet my gaze because it would mean acknowledging what he'd spent years trying to erase. That I was not weak, that I had not broken, that I had held back not because I lacked skill, but because I had been ordered to. He was a soldier of a different era, where strength was volume, and obedience was silence born of fear. But the silence I carried wasn't fear. It was discipline. A locked chamber with no key but purpose. He didn't know how to speak to that, so he said nothing. And in that silence, I realized something strange. I didn't need him to speak anymore. I didn't need his approval or his apology or his permission. His silence was enough. It told me everything I needed to know. It didn't take long for the whispers to evolve into something more calculated. A week after the test, an internal bulletin circulated. Unofficial, but authored by someone with clearance and arrogance. The phrasing was clever, surgical in its implication. It questioned whether the demonstration had been sanctioned to bolster female representation in elite combat programs. It never said I faked it. It didn't have to. The damage was done in the suggestion. Suddenly, my name was back in the air, but not because of what I had done, because of what they assumed had been done for me. I stayed silent. That silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't shame. It was what I was trained for. But silence in public spaces invites noise. People began to ask, if it was real, why isn't she defending herself? If she's innocent, why not speak up? Why would someone let a lie stand if they had the truth? Truth is, they didn't want truth. They wanted performance, a rebuttal, a press statement, a teary rebuttal on camera. But I wasn't trained for cameras. I was trained to enter shadows and leave no footprints. It was Callum who made the noise. I didn't ask him to. I hadn't even seen him since the shot. But he submitted a technical report, unprompted, unflinching. 6 pages, titled, Ballistics Assessment of 2,000-Yard Confirmed Impact. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't defensive. It was cold, clinical, brutal in its detail. It included wind speed data, humidity readings, a breakdown of the round used, the barrel length, the scope calibration. It traced the curvature of the Earth, mapped the mirage layer that day, calculated the exact second I pulled the trigger. Then, one final line. There is no mathematical evidence to support this, was anything but authentic. I was there. She made the shot. Sergeant Callum Hayes. The name at the bottom gave it weight. A respected trainer, a man known for never endorsing anyone. It made its way through the chain, quietly but thoroughly. I didn't thank him. He didn't expect it. We were soldiers, not celebrities. Still, the questions lingered. Not about the shot now, but about me. Why didn't she defend herself? Because I wasn't there to win arguments. I was there to serve, to do what I was told, to complete the mission, and then disappear again. But part of me understood what the silence really did. It made people uncomfortable. It held a mirror up. Because the truth was, they didn't doubt me. They feared me. They feared what it meant that a woman could outshoot them, outrank them, and say nothing. They feared that she didn't even care to prove them wrong. And in that fear, they twisted the narrative. It was easier to call it a trick than admit it was real. And it was easier to label me difficult than to call me what I was. Disciplined, deadly, deliberate. So I let them talk. Because in the end, none of them could look me in the eye. Not anymore. And silence was louder than any shout. I never answered the bulletin, never submitted a rebuttal, never clarified the facts, never joined the whispers. Because I didn't need to. I had spent years being trained to observe. And if there was one thing I knew how to do, it was read a room. They had seen it, the truth. It wasn't something I needed to shout. It was something they had watched unfold, frame by frame, my breath, the shot, the silence after. And it was in that silence where the truth lived. The ones who mocked me now avoided my gaze. The ones who doubted, they couldn't even look at me the same way. I could feel the shift, not in what they said, but in what they didn't. The truth had spoken in wind and distance, in ballistics and physics, in a white flag folding 2,000 yards away. What could I say that would carry more weight than that? Some still speculated. That's fine. There are people who will drown in noise because they can't survive the quiet. But I didn't need their permission to be who I was. I didn't need their approval to justify my training. What I had done, what I had endured, wasn't for them. It was never about proving anything to people who had already decided I was unworthy. It was for something bigger, something I couldn't even name some days. But it had always lived in the silence between breaths, the silence between orders, the silence between being underestimated and being seen. So I let the silence stand. Let them fill it with whatever they needed. Rumors, theories, doubt. None of it could undo what they witnessed. None of it could erase that moment. And more than anything, none of it could hurt me anymore, because I didn't need to defend myself. Not to men who called me dead weight until they saw me move. Not to my father, who could only process strength if it came from someone else. Not to a world that still believed women had to explain their excellence. Some things don't need defense, they only need distance. And mine was exactly 2,000 yards. It didn't happen all at once. Justice never does. But I knew what I had to do the moment I saw how far he was willing to go. How deep he was willing to bury me just to protect the illusion of his own authority. My father had built a career out of posturing, of war rooms and whiteboards, of simulations and theories, of barking orders from 10,000 miles away. And now, as a senior strategic advisor, his words still moved troops. But I had begun to notice something no one else seemed to. His strategies were flawed. His instincts were outdated. And his pride was lethal. I started collecting, quietly, deliberately, memos, email trails, debriefs, classified slides with redacted timestamps, files showing gross oversight, near-miss operations he'd recommended, errors masked as acceptable losses. It wasn't personal, it was necessary. Because I had seen too many good soldiers pay for bad leadership. Because he wasn't just my father anymore. He was a man who held power without accountability. And that's the most dangerous kind. I didn't confront him, didn't shout, didn't threaten. I simply walked into the office of the Inspector General and handed over the file. No introduction, no statement. Just a stack of cold, clinical facts. I left the building with my hands light. Not triumphant, not bitter, just clear. Because this wasn't revenge, it was responsibility. For every soldier who didn't have the clearance I had. For every young recruit who would never question orders. For every whisper I heard in briefing rooms about old men sending kids to die. He used to tell me that leadership was lonely, but he had confused loneliness with entitlement. He thought silence meant respect. He never realized silence was just fear wearing a uniform, and I wasn't afraid anymore. A few weeks later, the investigation began. Quiet at first, then loud. Whispers followed him through corridors now. Somewhere between the chain of command and the press release, he was asked to take administrative leave. They called it early retirement. He called it betrayal. I didn't correct him. Because maybe to him it was. Maybe watching the daughter he trained dismantle his reputation felt like treason. But to me, it was justice. And justice doesn't ask for permission. It just shows up, unarmed, undeniable, and sometimes It looks like your own daughter handing in a folder and walking away without a word. The hallway was quiet. Government quiet. Muted paint, a clock ticking too loudly, fluorescent lights buzzing above like a whisper no one could shut off. I spotted him before he saw me. My father. He sat on a bench outside the hearing room. Alone. The uniform he once wore like armor was now folded neatly on his lap, like a memory too fragile to carry on his shoulders anymore. No medals, no stars, just fabric and silence. His eyes were fixed on the floor, but they lifted when I approached. No arrogance, no cold fury. Just the hollow expression of a man who had finally been removed from the battlefield. Not by force, but by truth. He opened his mouth, ready to speak. I raised a hand just slightly and shook my head once. Slow, final. He stopped, swallowed his words. I took a seat beside him, not close, but not far. We sat in silence, the kind that wasn't angry, just finished. I looked straight ahead. He looked at me, and then softly I spoke. You once told me to keep my eye on the target. Block out the noise, breathe through the wind. I turned to face him, his eyes tired, his hands shaking just enough to betray what pride had masked for years. I did what you taught me. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I saw the target, and I hit it. His lips trembled, as if he wanted to object. Not to defend himself, but to ask for something he no longer had the rank to request. Redemption, but I wasn't there for absolution. He nodded slowly, as if trying to accept a truth he had spent a lifetime denying. That I was never weak, that he was never invincible. The door down the hall opened. An aide called his name. He stood slower than usual, the folded uniform still in his hands like a flag at half-mast. He walked a few steps, then paused. And without turning around, he said it, a whisper. You were the better soldier. Then he left. Not like a man defeated, not like a father broken. Just quiet. I remained on the bench for a while. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just still. I had always thought closure would be louder, but maybe real closure doesn't come with applause or punishment. Maybe it comes when the person who once doubted you finally sees you for what you are and can no longer look away. I didn't report back to base that day, didn't call anyone. I just walked out into the parking lot, took off my jacket, let the wind hit my face. The mission was over. And for the first time in my life, he wasn't the one who decided that. Callum found me later that evening, leaning against the hood of a Humvee, watching the wind lift dust across the lot. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me, our shoulders a foot apart, both staring at nothing in particular. Then finally, he asked it. Simple, quiet. Do you regret it? I didn't answer right away. I let the question settle, roll around in the silence between us. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. They hadn't shaken in a long time. I turned to him and said, no, then added, but I'm not happy about it either. He nodded. He didn't need more, because we both knew justice doesn't come with relief. It doesn't taste like victory. It's bitter, heavy, but necessary, I told him. People think justice feels like the lifting of a burden, but really, it's just putting the weight where it belongs. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. I continued, what I did, it wasn't personal, it wasn't revenge. It was the only way to stop pretending that silence was strength. Callum looked at me then, fully, not with pity, not with admiration, just understanding. He said, it changed him. I shook my head. It revealed him. A pause. He was never untouchable, Callum. Just unchallenged. He stayed quiet, but I saw the way his fists loosened. Like he'd been holding something in two. The stars were just beginning to show. The kind of night where nothing gets said out loud, but everything gets heard. And in that moment, I realized something. Closure isn't loud. It's not dramatic. It's just two people standing still, knowing nothing more needs to be said. He patted the hood of the Humvee once. You good? I looked at him. Not a smile, not a frown, just truth. I will be. He nodded, walked away, and I stayed, letting the cool settle into my bones, knowing that justice was never supposed to feel good. Just right. I returned to the training range 1 year later. No uniform, no rank. No rifle slung across my back. Just me, in civilian boots, standing on the scorched earth where I once lay prone. The day I became someone my father could no longer deny. The wind was calmer now, the sky wide and blue. The red dirt was cracked, sun hardened. I traced the invisible line from where I stood across the field to the spot where that white flag had once waved in the crosshairs of my scope. It wasn't there anymore. They replaced it each year, I was told. A new flag, a fresh beginning. But they never moved the post. Same distance, 2,000 yards. I knew it in my bones. I wasn't here to prove anything. Not to them, not to him, not even to myself. I was just here, standing in the quiet. They said the shot was impossible, but it wasn't. The math worked. The air cooperated. My heart was steady. But what really made that shot happen wasn't in the bullet. It was in the years I spent being doubted, being diminished, being told I didn't belong. It was in the silence I learned to master, in the weight I carried for too long. In the moment Commander Reeves whispered not an order, but a permission I didn't know I'd been waiting for. Just once, he'd said, "Let me see you shoot for real." People think the 2,000-yard shot changed everything. They're wrong. It revealed what had always been true, that I didn't miss because I wasn't capable. I missed because I wasn't allowed to be. And when I was, the world had to catch up. I walked down the range now, toward where the flag once stood. The sun beat down through my shirt. Each step felt heavier than I remembered, but also freer. At the post, I knelt, touched the base. It was scarred, burnt from too much sun, weathered, but it stood. Still. So was I. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed in the dust and wind and remembered what it felt like to aim at something people thought I couldn't see. I turned back, walked the distance again. Not a soldier anymore, just a woman who once made an impossible shot, and no longer needed anyone to acknowledge it. Sometimes people recognize me, not always, not often, but sometimes. They lower their voices when they say my name. They ask questions, the usual ones. Was it really 2,000 yards? Did your father ever apologize? Are you still in? But once in a while, just once in a while, someone asks the only question that ever matters. Was it worth it? And I always answer the same way. I didn't do it for worth. I did it so I wouldn't have to bow my head anymore. Because worth, like approval, is just another uniform you can be stripped of. But dignity? Dignity is what you keep when all else is taken. I don't look for medals. I don't speak on stages. I don't take interviews. I live quietly now. I train young shooters, but only those who've been overlooked. The ones with shaky hands and quiet eyes. The ones people call dead weight. Sometimes I catch a whisper of what they say behind my back. She's the one, the sniper from that story. And I let it pass, because I know something they don't. That story isn't about a bullet, or a target, or a shot across a battlefield. It's about silence, and what it takes to survive inside it. It's about how sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that doesn't need to shout. My father never spoke to me again after the hearing. He was removed from his advisory role, quietly, no disgrace, no front-page headlines. Just a faded man, standing in a hallway, holding a folded uniform like a truth he never wanted to face. He tried to speak that day. I shook my head and said, "I only did what you taught me, aim and hit what matters." That was our last exchange. Justice, people think, is loud, swift, cathartic. But sometimes, justice is just doing what's right and living with the silence that follows. Before we say goodbye, I'll leave you with this. If you ever find yourself standing at the edge of what others call impossible, if they doubt you, dismiss you, name you dead weight, don't fight back with noise. Take a breath, hold your ground, wait for your shot, because one day the world will see what you already know, that you were never too weak. They were just too loud to notice. And when the dust settles, if someone asks, "Did it matter?" you can smile, turn your back to the wind, and walk away. Because some targets aren't meant to be carried. They're meant to be left behind, like a still shot in the distance. Proof that you were there, and you didn't miss.